Welcome to Risk Engineers Talk Governance. In this episode, due diligence engineers Richard Robinson and Gaye Francis discuss how to prevent catastrophic project blowouts. We hope you enjoy their chat. If you do, please give us a rating and subscribe on your favourite podcast platform. If you'd like more information on R2A's work or have any feedback or topic ideas, please head to the website r2a.com.au.
Hello, Richard. Welcome to another podcast session.
Good morning, Gaye. Interesting trip in today, wasn't it?
It has. It's been a difficult morning start to the morning, but we're here now. We're ready to do a podcast. So today we're going to talk about preventing catastrophic project blowouts, and it's sort of a bit timely in that we've just updated our little booklet.
Yep.
For 2025, and that's now available.
And you might notice one of my favourite chapters is in it.
What's your favourite chapter?
Eek, irk and oops.
You can tell Richard went about naming some of these chapters, can't you?
Oh, yes, but see, as I explained this to you a long time ago, and one of the first things that happened when you arrived at R2A, if I recall correctly, and you said there's a fourth term, because I was explaining how these are three critical terms in risk. And you said, the fourth term is grr. And I said, what does that mean? She said, it arises when you're a younger female working with an older male.
It's probably still exists today, even though we've aged a little bit. So we've gone out on a tangent already in the first 2 minutes of the podcast, but that's all right. So preventing catastrophic project blowouts, and it was also timely in that there was a recent article in Create at the end of February, and it was called...
Create magazine from Engineers Australia.
Correct. Big budget blowouts costing billions each year, and it was basically an interview and a chat with the National Chair of the Cost Engineering Society, and it sort of covered projects like Inland Rail, Snowy Hydro, the North East Link, Paradise Dam, Project Energy Connect, and then the North East Link. And I think one of the interesting things that it said was they're typically not technical issues that slow a project down or stop a project down. And when they were talking about budget blowouts, they were talking in terms of cost, time, and also scope, which was an interesting one. But they were saying that the engineers aren't sort of so good at communicating such things as the environmentals approvals and legislation and land acquisition issues, and they're typically the issues that can blow projects out. So it was really interesting. I think one of the interesting things that he said was typically projects don't go wrong, they start wrong. And I think some of our stuff that we would observe in the project due diligence stuff that we do, and I think the governance process and the due diligence process at R2A applies to projects, probably extends that cost engineering idea further, because he's sort of talking about typically the most likely type of blowouts and things that can go wrong in projects, and starting with other projects. But we're saying, what are those catastrophic issues, regardless of how likely they are, that can stop a project?
Yeah, and the key thing was to make sure you understand what it is you're actually doing. I mean, one of the points we make is that our approach to all this is a very military intelligence approach, because we learned, I got this off Bob Browning all those years ago, and he got it off MI6, I think it was, when he was on exchange to the UK. But the point was, you need to clearly understand what it is you're trying to achieve and setting out to achieve. And if you don't get that right, it will come unstuck. And I say it's the military intelligence technique, because one of the things that you try to do if you're about to go on a military mission on which your life depends, and if you get it wrong, things are going to go badly, you need to really spell out what success looks like and how you're going to get there. And then you make sure that anything that threatens those outcomes are dealt with. We call them vulnerabilities. But that means we're looking at control. And one of the more interesting articles that popped up, I don't know quite why I came across it, but I was doing a search for some work we're doing. I was a course last week.
Last week for defence.
For defence. And I came across an article it was an RMIT researcher and a New Zealand Army personnel person. And they were reviewing 10 years of the implication of WHS legislation on defence in Australia. And they said, this is sort of the first study that's been done, because it's been around now for about 10 years from defence's viewpoint, because it commenced in 2012. And they were asking the question, well, what's the impact? And the last sentence, literally the last sentence in the whole article just says, the WHS legislation, the difference is made, it's not about the level of risk, it's all about the level of control. And that's the final conclusion. And that's our point, because our frustration with all this stuff is particularly to do with the risk management standard. And I suppose I could mention a current court case I've got, but people are still doing risk assessments, working out target levels of risk and safety, when the legislation, it's just flowing from that very human thing. It's not the level of risk that counts, it's always been the level of control. And that's the same thing whether it's projects or safety.
And I think that's the difficult conversation that people have to have, isn't it? Often the project comes unstuck because the aim or the objectives of the project aren't articulated, that all the stakeholders agree that that's what they're working towards.
Correct. And that's one of those things, I mean, we make the remark about, we watch Defence and some of their gate procurement processes, and if you don't keep an eye on what the overall outcome is, I mean, they go through this gate and there's a 2-year team that's got to get through the next gate. Well, for them, that's their critical success outcomes. But if that team there isn't looking to what the final outcome is supposed to be, then they set all the other teams in the following gates up for the fall.
So I think the idea of scope creep's a little bit of a funny one, because you've actually got to go back and say, all right, if we change that in our project, how does that affect our critical success outcomes? And it's not just time and budget, it's actually, is it actually delivering what we want it to deliver, and do all the stakeholders agree to that?
Yes, and one of the problems we've got is times change, and if it's a long project, people's perceptions change, and what's important, what it was trying to achieve can change too. I mean, one of the funny things last week we got asked about Agile, and I had a quick look at that. I mean, I've come across it before, but like all the different techniques that pop, like Prince 2 and all the other ones that different people say, this is the way to do it. If you don't do it this way, it's a failure. Whereas I think we would say it's better off to think through what you're trying to achieve rather than just rely on a
previous experience on other projects, I think, would be our guess, to think it through. And then you test, I mean, don't lose all that lessons learned and everything, but don't use it as the basis for going forward. Use it as insight to reflect on the project that you're doing.
But you've got to make sure you understand what it is you're trying to achieve, and if you don't, it will come and haunt you.
We've actually walked away from projects because they couldn't articulate what they were trying to achieve.
Well, you might remember that large D-cell project in Victoria, and the project manager wanted to do it our way, and because they wouldn't do it our way, he walked.
I think one of the other difficult things, there's a lot of pressure on projects at the moment, and they're saying that there's big project blowouts and things like that. But many of these projects were scoped and started and estimated before COVID and during COVID. And I think times have really changed. There's a big difference in the costs associated with projects in today's dollars compared to what they were 5 years ago.
It's been 10% per year roughly from what I can see. You watch the CPI figures and things like that, and what's happening in procurement and so forth. Although I was listening to somebody saying, and one of the problems is just not enough people to do things at the moment. Getting anybody to even give you a quote or a tender is getting problematic.
Yeah.
But somebody did say that that's all starting to slow down a bit, and there might be more bodies available to do things in the future.
So maybe there'll be a improvement in some of those.
Maybe. I don't know. The world is a very strange place at the moment if anybody's watching politics.
It's also, for us, we often see that, look, typically projects do some sort of risk management or due diligence with their projects.
They always do. Whether it's successful or not is the next question.
Yeah. I think the other thing is that we often see missing is there's gaps in it. There's not a completeness check of ideas, and a lot of the work that we do, I think that's one of our key criticisms of the risk processes or due diligence work that people undertake, or organisations and projects undertake, is you don't have that sense of completeness. It's sort of a brain dump of issues in no particular order, and I would agree with the chair of the Cross Engineering Society in that, I think typically it's not technical issues that,
No, there's a pretty good technique. For a known technical issue, they're seldom failed. It's the unknown one or unspecified one that nobody quite understood was there or chose not to understand.
And so there's some planning associated with that. But if you go through a project due diligence viewpoint and you list the threads by project life cycle, starting at the very, very top where you've got procurement and planning and approvals processes, one of the things that the Inland Rail was getting getting a bit of a bad rap about was basically it's a rail project, but it's going through 3 different jurisdictions, which means that there's 3 different approval processes, and they didn't allow sufficient time. And I don't know whether they were actually, one approval before you could get the next approval, or whether you could go and get them concurrently.
You might remember the Tugun bypass, Queensland to New South Wales going under a federal airport, and we had 40 people in the room, remember,
Yeah.
because it was all becoming a bit unstuck. But it did come down to who had the biggest, well, I'm not quite sure, but it seemed to me that the Queenslands were paying for, but New South Wales had the greatest impact, which seemed a bit unfair to me.
I think that was because from emergency services viewpoint, they were the one that would respond to any incident under the tunnel. So that's that discussion around which we've had many times around stakeholders, key
Yep.
stakeholders and interested parties who actually live and dies by this thing. So by going through all of this stuff, it's not just the technical issues. If your project's only considering the technical issues, you will come unstuck.
Yeah, and people are still trying to apply the risk management standard. I mean, just again, because of this ectus witness thing, I mean, you're talking about unlikely things, right? And one of the things is experts are not omniscient. They can't be. So they can't say, when you're talking about rare, big, bad things, they of themselves can't say what all those things are and how they might manifest. But you can go about it another way. But if you try to risk assess it and you're trying to say, I've identified them all, it's all about the control. It's not about the risk assessment. That doesn't help at that point, because you cumulatively can't work out from a calculation viewpoint what that might be.
So the 3 key things that we would say for project due diligence and preventing catastrophic project blowouts is make sure you've got your scope right and you've identified what your critical
And you've
success
communicated
outcomes.
to everybody so everybody understands what the prize is.
And everyone agrees. It's always a bonus. I think you have to have a completeness check of threats.
Yep.
Because you can't manage the surprises. You can projects can typically manage things that can go wrong. And then, after you said it's a controls review to say, well, these are the controls you can put in place to protect against these sort of threats.
And things that pop up, if you've got the control there, can be dealt with. But when there's no control, it's just a surprise.
And I guess that takes us down to a last point. It's not do your due diligence review or your risk assessment and then pop it on the shelf for the entire remainder of the project. You've actually got to review these things on a regular basis, and the key times to do that are project milestones, or if there's one of those scope changes being proposed, you really got to pull that out and say, well, what does that scope change actually do to our project and where we are? Now, you can redefine it. That's fine. Yep. But you have to take everybody on the journey, and it has to be transparent and clear.
And that's what I understood the Agile process was trying to do.
A change management process. Okay. So, again, we're not saying that, any of these things are wrong or anything like that.
Hang on a minute. We've been crucifying the risk management standard, and I will point out that...
in isolation.
But I will point out that article I read. It was commenting that the Engineers Australia safety guideline actually said the risk management standard was an error, and that the Defence had been agreeing with that.
For safety terms.
For safety terms.
Correct. So understand what your different processes and tools do, and then, use them as guidance rather than the answer, I would say.
Yep.
Thank you for joining us today, and we hope that our chat has prevented a catastrophic project blowout for your particular project. Thanks, Richard.
Thanks, Gaye. Always interesting.
Bye.